everyone. A slight change in location this week, but hopefully shouldn't affect the lecture too much. So over the next couple of weeks, we're going to be focusing on the issue of mass victimisation. So until now, we've been focusing very much on the individuals that could be targeted because of, as victims, because of some particular inherent characteristic, let's say, such as race, such as gender, such as age, etc. There are aspects of those different types of victimisation that you could also argue to be mass victimisation of a sort, particularly, let's say, if you were looking at social class, which we talked about, whereby we were talking about people that share similar characteristics may well find themselves being similar victims or victims of similar types of crime. But the reality is, with those situations, it does tend to be individuals that are the direct victim of any particular act of victimisation, as opposed to whole groups of individuals being targeted for direct victimisation. So indeed, what we're saying is that those other areas that we've talked about, race, class, gender, etc., indirectly the victimisation may affect entire groups. But in terms of direct victimisation, there's usually a direct individual target or perhaps couple of targets. And so you wouldn't necessarily class that as being mass victimisation as such, although you may be able to find examples of mass victimisation within that. When we are talking about mass victimisation, then, we're going to be talking about areas whereby it's entire groups of people that have been targeted directly for victimisation. And as you all know, one of the areas that is my kind of specialist area that I research and that I teach also in other modules on, relates to Rwanda, 1994, the genocide against the Tutsi people in Rwanda that took place in Rwanda in 1994. And some of you may have heard some of what we're going to be talking about now in the past, particularly if you took the Contemporary Studies in Criminal Justice module last term. But of course, there will be some more added value, I think, in the areas we're going to be talking about over the next couple of weeks. So what we're going to be using is the example of genocide, whereby it's an entire group that share an ethnic identity that were being targeted for destruction in some way. So this lecture is going to be a little bit different because I'm going to be sharing not only some of the academic discussion that exists, but I'm also going to be talking about some of my own personal experiences in Rwanda and related to Rwanda. And so this lecture and these next couple of lectures are probably a bit more personal to me than some of what we've talked about in the past on the module. I'll be sharing with you much more, rather than memes, I'll be sharing with you much more of the actual photos, particularly a lot of photos that I personally have taken or that have been taken of me, with some other general photos related to Rwanda. And just to alert you, some of those photos could be a little bit graphic, could potentially be a little bit upsetting. And so this is just to give you fair warning that some of those photos might be that little bit upsetting or graphic. Most aren't, but there are some that may be. And so it can be quite difficult to look over some of this material if these are not subject matters that you're used to talking about and seeing. However, given this is an honours level module, and particularly given the subject matter of what we're talking about, I think it is important that you actually do see the very real effects that such mass victimisation can have. I'll be perfectly honest, I don't really know how many videos this is going to take because it does depend on how long I talk over some of the areas that we are talking about, but I will try and break up the videos into slightly smaller lengths of videos so that you can digest them a little bit more easily. So we're going to start off, and I've got a picture that I want to show you related to a place called Murambi, and I'm going to talk over Murambi first, and I want to set the scene for you before talking in depth about the sort of academic or technicalities of the subject matter. So there's a place called Murambi, and you'll see this now in a photograph on the screen. And Murambi was in Rwanda, in the south of Rwanda. So Rwanda is a country which is landlocked in that it doesn't have any borders onto any seas as such. There is one border that's onto a big lake, but it's a landlocked country whereby it sits in central East Africa. And to the north you have Uganda, To the east, you have Tanzania. To the south, you have Burundi. And to the west, you have the Democratic Republic of Congo. And it was previously called Zaire at the time that the genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda took place in. So Murambi was in the south, relatively close to the border with Burundi. Not too close, but relatively close. And this was a technical college or a technical school, which was in the process of being constructed and built. It wasn't yet open to house pupils or students yet, but it was a matter of weeks away from completion. All of the structures were there. We had the main building, which is what you can see in the first picture here. And there were also a number of outer buildings as well at the back. These outer buildings which were to be used for a combination of teaching rooms and spaces and accommodation blocks for the students that would have been at the technical college when it was due to open. Now, so this was quite a big area that was set out. And Murambi could be likened to, albeit not for the same length of time, but it's Rwanda's equivalent of a concentration camp, similar to what you might know or see at somewhere like Auschwitz. Now, Murambi wasn't, of course, purpose-built to be a concentration camp like that. It just happened to be the sort of facility that was able to be used in that way. So to explain, we had a group of people who shared the ethnic identity of Tutsi. And during the weeks of mid-April 1994, all chaos, all hell broke out in Rwanda for reasons that we'll come on to when we go over a bit of a timeline later on. And the Tutsi people were misled, shall we say, those that lived in the region of Murambi, and were told that, this was a dangerous time to be a Tutsi in the country, and that there was this place, Murambi, close by, that you could go to for protective custody. And what happened was around about 50,000 people ended up, Tutsi people ended up in Murambi, whereby they were told they were going to be kept in protective custody, but what they were to be subject to could be really termed anything but protective in nature. So it became pretty clear after a few days that the situation was bad, when any Tutsi that tried to leave the area of Murambi was shot and killed on sight at one of any of the roadblocks that had been set up strategically around the Murambi location. And again, there was about 50,000 people in Murambi at the time. And at that particular time then, we had the situation that all electricity and all water was then cut off from the buildings. And so the people inside, of course, were going to struggle to really have any sort of standard of living for the short time that they were there. No food was allowed to be brought in or out of the compound, and the people that were living there were then, of course, becoming weaker as the days went on. After the passage of a couple of weeks, the Hutu, which was the other ethnic identity group, and particularly the group known as the Interahamwe, which was the youth militant wing of the ruling MRND political party that was in charge of Rwanda at the time. So the Interahamwe were the youth militant wing of that political party, and they had been mobilised over the previous few weeks to effectively track down and kill any Tutsi that they encountered. So they came in the dead of night one evening to Murambi, and they were all bussed in to the location with weapons. And by weapons, we're talking, yes, there were some guns, there were some grenades, but mainly we're talking about machetes, clubs, other agricultural tools that would kill people in the most barbaric of fashions. And so in the dead of night, the Interahamwe and other Hutu militia went into Murambi and began the massacre. Now at that stage, as weakened as they were, because of the numbers that were in Murambi of the Tutsi, we're talking again about 50,000, they were able initially to push back that first onslaught against them. And so the Interahamwe and the other Hutu militia backed off a little bit. But they didn't give up, of course. The roadblocks were still in place. There was still no way in or out for any of the Tutsi that were trapped there. And again, as the days went on, and those that had survived, the thousands that had survived that first onslaught, were still becoming weaker and weaker with no food, no running water. So after another few days, again in the dead of night, there was another strong push by the Interahamwe and the other Hutu militia to go and finish the job. And this time they were successful in actually finishing off the job. And out of about 50,000 Tutsi that had been brought to Murambi, there were only a small number. There was only around about 30 to 50-ish survivors out of those 50,000 that made it out of Murambi alive. And that was mainly because of the chaos that was ensuing, hiding under dead bodies, managing to hide in some of the shrubbery or in some of the ventilation shafts that existed in the college at the time. A small number managed to survive, but close to 50,000 Tutsi were massacred at Murambi. They were in fact buried in mass graves that again you can see in one of the pictures here, one of the mass graves that was later uncovered at Murambi at the time. And these bodies were not uncovered until some months after the end of the genocide, by chance, when the ground was being surveyed for future construction work at the time. Indeed, one of the mass graves was discovered under a volleyball court that some of the French military had been playing volleyball on, as they eventually moved in and used Murambi as a base for their activities after the events that had uncovered there. And so it was only discovered sometime later that there was a number of these mass graves, each of which in the area held thousands of bodies of the Tutsi that had been exterminated there. Now, Murambi today, the job of the buildings being a technical college never came to pass. It was thought to be too inappropriate for that sort of location to then be turned into a school, particularly with the mass graves and the significance of what had happened there. And so the buildings now stand as a permanent location, a permanent commemoration to the genocide against the Tutsi. So it is set up as a memorial site, and the main building is a little bit like a museum, whereby there's all sorts of boards and TV screens and things that you can go to like a museum and learn about what happened there. But that's in the main building. If you do go to visit Murambi, as well as the main building, there are those outer buildings that we mentioned a moment ago. And those outer buildings, there was a lot of thought put into what they ought to be used for, and they're separate from the main building. And it was decided that in the horrible day and age that we live in, whereby there are all sorts of conspiracy theories that you see, you've got things like Holocaust denial, and there are also those that try to deny that there was a genocide that happened in Rwanda in spite of the unbelievably overwhelming evidence to the contrary that exists. But they still do try and deny it. And it was thought that there could be a brutal, shall we say, what might appear brutal display, a macabre display that has been created in order that anybody that goes there can face up to the realities of genocide. And so those outer buildings, each of them that you go into, room after room after room, has on wooden slatted purpose-built beds the bodies, the mummified bodies of a number of those Tutsi victims. And again, just to warn you, there's a picture that will come up just now showing you some of these bodies as they are today. These are bodies that are mummified. How did they become mummified? Well, there was two ways they became mummified. First of all, the bodies that had been thrown in the mass graves had been thrown and packed in so tightly together that some of the bodies, and particularly those that were in the middle of the mass graves, had effectively been kept almost airtight, such that there was no air and no real degradation that was able to take place with a lot of those bodies. And a lot of the bodies were then crushed and packed down, which is why some of the bodies you can see look or appear to be almost deformed, because they were crushed with the weight of the other bodies on top and around about them. but also because the composition of the ground around about Murambi is slightly alkaline in nature, and that is the same sort of chemical compound that is actually used to mummify bodies. So those combined factors meant that a substantial number of those bodies that had been buried in mass graves, in the months that they were left buried, effectively became mummified. The bodies that you can see here are somewhat whitened because in order to further preserve those bodies, there's again a fine powder that is sprinkled over those bodies on a daily basis that does stop them from decomposing more than they already have been. There's also actually a scientific unit which has been established at Murambi to try and actually study the preservation of bodies and materials. And I don't have any photos of that, although I have visited it, and indeed some students have visited that with me. It is quite, again, a sobering and rather brutal sight to behold when you go into that scientific unit. But there are about 1,000 bodies that are on display in Murambi in this way that you can walk into the rooms and view. Not a particularly pretty sight, I'm sure you will agree. Horrible as it is, it's not just adult victims, and this is one of the realities of a crime like genocide, whereby one of the purposes of genocide, when somebody is perpetrating genocide, is to try and prevent the next generation of the group that have been targeted from being able to exist. And as such, what that then means is that it's not just the adults, it's not combatants like in a war that are targeted. Instead, it's anybody that either is from or is affiliated with that group in question. So in Rwanda's case, anybody that was Tutsi or anybody that was linked with the Tutsi, that had, let's say, sympathies for the Tutsi, anyone that might be a barrier to the Hutu objectives of exterminating the Tutsi would have been targeted, and that includes young children. And so indeed there are some bodies of young children that you will see on display there. Again, not a particularly nice thing. So this kind of sets the scene for us in terms of the realities of mass victimization such as genocide. And we've talked about genocide then and begun to give you an understanding of what genocide is. We need to then think about the specific definitions of genocide that are applied in situations like this. So we have to go back to the aftermath of World War II here for this one, and a scholar named Raphael Lemkin. So Raphael Lemkin, who was one of those scholars that was considering what had happened in the Holocaust. And it's important for you to realise that genocides have happened throughout history, but they just weren't necessarily specifically called genocides because there wasn't a term to call that sort of mass victimization at that point. The term genocide was really coined in the direct aftermath of World War II, when the conscience of mankind had been shocked by what had happened through the Holocaust at that time. Of course, mainly targeting Jewish people, but also other groups, including traveller groups, etc. So Lemkin, in 1946, discussed that the crime of genocide should be recognised therein as a conspiracy to exterminate national, religious or racial groups. The overt acts of such a conspiracy may consist of attacks against life, liberty or property of members of such groups, merely because of their affiliation with such groups. The formulation of the crime may be as follows: whoever, while participating in a conspiracy to destroy a national, racial or religious group, undertakes an attack against life, liberty or property of members of such groups is guilty of the crime of genocide. So what Lemkin was talking about here then was it was this idea that if people targeted for victimization, a whole group of people based upon some characteristic they hold, such as being a member of a race group or an ethnic group or a religious group or a nationality, if somebody is targeted directly for victimization because of either their membership of that group, so because they are actually one of those groups, but importantly also it's talking about if they are attacked because they're also affiliated with that group in some way. So it could be someone, let's say, that works for a victims advocate group or a minority advocate group, someone that might not be a member of that group, but they have a significant link to that group in some way. They could also be targeted directly, not because they are a member of the group, but because they have an affiliation with that group. And they would be treated as a victim of genocide in the same way that a member of that group being targeted would be. So this was Lemkin's discussion in the aftermath of World War II related to what genocide is. And this definition was honed a little bit, it was clarified a little bit. So the United Nations General Assembly, through Resolution 96 of the United Nations General Assembly, effectively adopted Lemkin's definition of genocide and this explanation of what was meant by the term genocide. And what the United Nations General Assembly said was, genocide is a denial of the right of existence of entire human groups, as homicide is the denial of the right to life of individual human beings. Such denial of the right to existence shocks the conscience of mankind and is contrary to moral law and to the spirit and aims of the United Nations. And the General Assembly therefore affirms that genocide is a crime under international law, whether the crime is committed on religious, racial, political, or any other grounds. So what the United Nations here is saying is that just as the crime of homicide is denying an individual the right to life, the crime of genocide is denying the right to life to an entire group of people, i.e. this is a form of mass victimisation. Now, importantly for you to realise, for somebody to be convicted of genocide and for someone to be a victim of genocide doesn't necessarily always mean that the victim has been killed. The denial of the right to life is mainly about the killing of that group, the targeted killing of that group. But the definition actually also extends beyond that. So to explain, when the United Nations then formulated the crime of genocide within the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, so this is what the discussion that they had said at the General Assembly about genocide was then later formulated into the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. And within this, it more clearly defined exactly what does constitute the crime of genocide. So what it says within that convention under Article 2 is, any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial or religious group as such, and it gives you then a list of the acts. A, killing members of the group. B, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group. C, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. D, imposing measures intended to prevent births within this group. And E, forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. So in general, when people think about the crime of genocide, they automatically just think about that group being, exterminated, killed. And that is in a genocide the main way in which genocide is perpetrated. But effectively, any serious act that is intended to prevent the ongoing existence of that group, so that will include preventing new births happening. It will include giving the children of that group to some other group to continue to look after, even perhaps. Any conditions that make life intolerable for the group in question by treating them as not only second but probably fifth or sixth class citizens, anything that makes their conditions of life almost impossible would render that act potentially an act of genocide. And there's a list of crimes that then comes under Article 3 of the Convention on Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. And what that sets out as being potentially genocidal acts includes A, genocide itself, B, conspiracy to commit genocide, C, direct and public incitement to commit genocide, so encouraging others to commit genocide, D, the attempt to commit genocide, And then E, even those that take a hands-off approach, but those that are in positions of responsibility and do nothing, so being complicit in genocide, all of those are crimes that are punishable under international law through the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. So that's a United Nations convention that exists. We've got other laws that exist, other statutes that exist, which further back up under international law that this crime of genocide is punishable. So under the Rome Statute of 2002, which established the International Criminal Court, which is permanently based in The Hague, and again I've got a little photograph here of myself at the International Criminal Court in The Hague here. So under the Rome Statute from 2002, it sets out that Article 6 of the Rome Statute provides that genocide means any of the following acts committed with the intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial or religious group. And it then sets out again effectively that same list. Killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, and forcibly transferring children of that group to another group. So again, the Rome Statute, in setting that out, is then saying if anybody commits any of those acts, and if anybody falls foul of that convention from the UN that we mentioned a moment ago, then they may be tried within the International Criminal Court in The Hague, and they're made to face justice for those acts of genocide that they committed or were complicit with relation to. So that introduces this issue of mass victimisation and genocide. We're going to finish up part 1 just now, because I want you to watch a little video that I have uploaded on Moodle for you. And it's a little video to do with Murambi, which is only a few minutes long. It's only a few minutes long. But this little video will be titled Genocide Video 1, and you should watch this to get an idea of what happened at Murambi and how the international community effectively sat back and did nothing to help the situation. So please watch that video now, and then you can move on to part 2 of the lecture. We'll see you then.